Hello, it's Ren Presents time. I'm your host, Ren, and today we continue with the Hazards of the Old Ones, Part 3, Chapter 14, Verlin's Hero. So, we downshift from the dire scene deep within Xandarr Keep, where our intrepid heroes are about to have their asses kicked by the Black Hats, whom they can't see or hear. The only one who could see and hear them, Captain Davidge, is incapacitated after wafting everyone to the other side of the hall so that a Black Hat couldn't send them in and kill them. Pretty grim situation, but we're gonna take a step back and examine the life of Lieutenant Verlin. I have to say, I've mentioned it before, this is book 2, so it was my second book, written quite a while ago. Were I to do it again, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't interrupt an epic battle scene for a character building chapter like this one. It's a good chapter, I enjoy it greatly, but I wouldn't have put it right in the middle of a frickin' dickin' poopin' doopin' battle. Call me whatever you want, that's how I did it. And there's no undoing it now. So here we are. I think I also mentioned previously that the character Lieutenant Verlin, I had big plans for using her beyond this book. I had intended her to be the love interest of Captain Davidge and Countess Sigillis' son, Lord Cable, who's not yet born in this book. And Verlin herself is probably in her 60s or 70s. And you have to remember again, these are elder kind. They don't age the way we do. They usually live to about 220 years old. As we found out earlier in the book, there's a specific reason why that specific number pops up as far as the longevity of a person's life. So a person who's in their 60s or 70s is still got over half their life ahead of them. They don't get old. A person in their 20s or their 60s or their 150s or their 200s look pretty much the same. They look like they're in the prime of their life. They don't get old and wrinkly. That was a gift that was given to them by the elders on camera 200,000 years prior. Among other things, if you recall from the chapter The Hazards of the Old Ones, we found out what else the elders gave to the elder kind. But in any event, so an age discrepancy like that, where Kay is just not even a toddler yet and Verlin is in her 60s, isn't that big of a deal necessarily. But as I started writing the Temple of the Exploding Head series, there was just no chemistry between these characters. And even me as the creator, I guess that's my job to give them chemistry, but it just didn't happen. It wasn't natural. I would have had to force things, and I just didn't. So I just eventually abandoned that idea, and I wrote Verlin out of the Temple of the Exploding Head series, replacing her with the much more approachable and affable Lady Sammy Dorn, who Kay did eventually marry. But when I was writing The Hazards, it was in my head that Verlin was going to play a role farther down the line with Captain Davidge's son. Never happened. What did happen, but it didn't pass the cheese, as they say. So we're going to downshift, take a break from all the fighting that's going on in Xandarr Keep, and we're going to delve into the life of Lieutenant Verlin. It's a good chapter. I like the things that happen in this chapter, but again, I probably would have done things differently had I to do it all over again. So let's proceed immediately. Part 3, Chapter 14, Verlin's Hero. Lieutenant Verlin sat in the captain's chair on the bridge. She was just now getting used to being on the bridge alone, without Captain Davidge, and, oddly enough, without Lieutenant Larson. She found she liked Larson. She liked him very much. What a fine gentleman. Witty, soft-spoken, good at his job, and quite handsome, too. How she wished she'd had a moment to get to know him more personally. Captain Davidge as well. He was every bit as first-rate as she had hoped. Confident and personable, approachable, easy to follow, easy to love. He was why she had wanted to come to the Seeker in the first place, for she had long followed his exploits with interest. With Davidge around, she felt empowered. She felt like she could command a whole armada. Without him, she wasn't quite so confident. She could certainly do without that Lieutenant Kylos character. Her arrival spoiled everything. She didn't like her at all. Didn't know what in creation the captain saw in her. A rowdy, unruly, unwashed Johnny, a bronzer, Major Westwind, also from Anaris, had called her. And not a flattering thing to say. She had hated to make a scene in the conference room, but Kylos had thrown it down, directly challenged her, and right in front of the captain, too. She had no choice but to fight her. What should the captain have thought had she not? She'd have proven that she was nothing but a timid lady of hobby, a whole family of weak, spineless merchants. She and Kylos will square it up later. She was eager to bounce her dainty hobby fists off of that Johnny's face. She was getting used to the bridge crew as well. She knew the helmsman's name was Sari, a lady of the House of Falls, blue-haired, stately, of a strong science ministry background, yet chose to serve the fleet. Rather like herself, Lady Sari had bucked tradition. She had strayed from her family's usual path. Sari also appeared to be a person who, like her, was extremely confident when Captain Davidge was around, but far less so when he was not. Sari was still fairly green, still needing a firm hand. She also knew that with the captain around, he could grab the wheel should things get too out of control. A huge safety net. The fore censor was manned by crewman Sassy, a lady of the House Cordial, again, an old house of Xenon. The comm was Lieutenant Gervin, a gentleman of House Rixon. The missive was a stately, if stuffy man with iron-gray hair who spoke often of his pending promotion to fleet command. A Lieutenant Durlith of the House of Cone, a Remnath house, and a distant relative of hers. Captain Davidge certainly had a commendable crew. A fine crew, indeed. The first time she'd ever seen Davidge, Lord of Blanchford, was 80 years prior, at his wedding. The failed wedding. The wedding that never happened. She was just a girl at the time. Her father, Lord Merivale of Hobby, a prosperous and well-regarded merchant of Howell, held the tiny Verlin in his arms, she wearing a child's pink gown in the Hobby fashion. She had a dim memory of seeing the wedding baton passing from her right to left as it made its way to the front of the procession. She remembered all the hands reaching out to touch it, to send it on its way. She recalled thinking the baton, bronze by tradition, all decorated and gilded in jewels, was pretty. She recalled wanting to play with it. She remembered the sound of the baton hitting the floor. It was a pleasing metallic sound, like a struck tuning fork. And most vivid of all, she recalled Davidge, Lord of Blanchford, go running past from right to left in his fine wedding attire, weapon at his side, chased closely by a woman in a blue gown. She remembered his face, the anguish, his eyes. She clearly remembered his eyes as he passed by. That was the first time she had ever seen sorrow. In later years, she never forgot those eyes. One lazy afternoon, she asked her mother about that man, the sad lord she remembered seeing as a girl. Her mother, Lady Jana, said he was Davidge, Lord of Blanchford, and that was the famous wedding that never was. Verlin didn't know where Blanchford was. Way to the north, her mother commented, where it's cold all the time. Verlin, always having an interest and a good head for geography, went to the library and got out a huge atlas. Wrestling with the book and tracing with her long fingers, she found Blanchfort. There it was, way far to the northwest of Howell, where she was, in the northern continent of Vithland. A sea and an angry mountain range and several thousand miles stood between Howell and Blanchfort. She made a mental note and added Blanchfort to the long list of places she wanted to visit when she was older and able to travel on her own. That might have been the end of her attention, had that very afternoon she not spied something in her day's reading that caught her attention. Unlike her 9 sisters and her many friends, Verlin loved to sit in her father's huge library and read. She read of the epochs of time, of fabled places like Amira, Camera, and Ing. She read of the 7 tribes of man. She read of the stories of the giants that once roamed Cana, and of the Vith heroes who fought them. She read of Gallia Palace, and the sad story that went with it. She also read the story of the House of Bottis from Hala, a house of farmers who were driven mad by a demon in the shape of an elephant and fled to the Zaffins for relief. The Bottis found no solace with the Zaffins and were preyed upon by them and made extinct. That was a sad book, one she didn't want to read again. She read bylines and editorials. She loved staying current on League happenings, but she generally avoided the lurid headlines and acerbic, catty articles dotting the fronts of the Post. One couldn't learn much from those. Rather, she liked reading the little items at the end of the posting. Those were jewels of information. That's where you kept on top of things. Crisp stories told neatly and succinctly without gloss or social commentary. That day, at the very end of the post, a small notice entitled, "Renowned Fleet Helmsman Promoted to Lieutenant." Prost, Synthnet. In a movement considered long overdue by the 10th Admiralty, the Stellar Fleet has promoted Master Helmsman Davidge, Lord of Blanchfort, to the ranking of full lieutenant. Lord Blanchfort, a helmsman of wide regard, has piloted the fleet vessel Faith in over 40 engagements against the Zaffin Armada, most notably at the Battle of Two Pitch Nebula, where the Faith survived unscathed against a force of ambushing Zaffin mercy ships. As Verlin greedily read the small, nondescript notice, she found herself becoming fascinated by the Lord of Blanchfort, the man with the sad eyes she had seen long ago. She made it a point to look for notices regarding this man and collecting them. It was difficult going, sometimes news was scarce, but every so often her efforts were rewarded. Fleet vessel Faith foils Zaffin attack. Brindisia Hoban Royal News Wire. In a daring action over Hoban, a 4-ship combat formation led by the main fleet vessel Prince Elmo discovered, met, and turned back a Zaffin attempt to abduct the governor of Brindisia. The surprise ship of note of the day's action was the Faith, a venerable Weber-class vessel chaired by the retiring Captain Garzamel, Lord of Champion. The Faith, helmed by the well-regarded Lieutenant Davidge, Lord of Blanchfort, blunted the Zaffin attack and turned it back, sinking their flagship Blood Simple, with many prisoners taken. The governor, Lord Basil of Croatoa, was not harmed in the assault. The Zaffin forces were, according to sources, under the command of Princess Marlith of Xandarr, who was once engaged to Lord Blanchfort, and so on. She eventually had a whole vid scrapbook detailing Lieutenant Davidge's exploits and career in minutiae. Verlin became a real fan of Lieutenant Davidge, following his activities as best she could. Borrowing her brother's telescope, she became familiar with the comings and goings of the fleet. It was easy to learn those things if one really wanted to, and trained the telescope up to the fleet docks high overhead. She nearly had a heart attack when, gliding into her viewfinder for the first time one evening, was the Faith. She was excited. She felt like a birdwatcher who had finally spied that rare, elusive specimen after much searching and dedication. It was an old ship, the Faith, a Weber class, being gangly, ugly in design, especially when compared with the brand new swan-like Straylights just coming off the blocks. But to Verlin, the Faith was a beautiful and proud vessel, flowing through space with a grand, graceful movement. She imagined Lieutenant Davidge standing there, the helm wheel firm in his grasp. She wondered if his eyes were still sad. When her sisters and her friends began concerning themselves with parties, gossip, and gentlemen, Verlin, though vaguely interested in gossip, was still mostly interested in the posts, in the word of Lord Blanchford. He was like a famous sportsman to her. From lieutenant to commander to captain of the main fleet vessel Seeker, she watched it all through the posts and through the telescope, for she had seen the beautiful Seeker too, soaring up there like a great white bird. As Captain Davidge's dealings with Princess Marlith of Xandarr became more and more frequent and more spectacular, his notices began a swift migration from the back of the posts to the front, blasted out in huge headlines. She couldn't help but feel somewhat saddened that her intimate personal relationship with Captain Davidge was now the talk of the League and subject of A-list gossip. It didn't seem as pure. Her family was invited to a grand party in Blanchford one year, and for a change, Verlin happily agreed to attend with her brothers and sisters. House Hobby had just completed a large business transaction with the House of Blanchford, and, as a courtesy, they were invited to a ball at Castle Blanchford. Being so far away from Howell, and they being Vith and the Hobbies being of Remnath stock, the two houses didn't usually interact socially. But it was a lovely trip. Verlin and her brothers and sisters all bundled up in their fur-lined cloaks and mufflers, piled into the house transport ship and headed north. Howell, being a very temperate place, Blanchford was brutally cold for them. But what a wonderful place, Blanchford, tucked up in the breathtaking northern mountains, cold certainly, but pretty with a quaint village by the sea. Their huge Vith castle was one of the finest she'd ever been in. The ball was lavish and full of all that old Vith circumstance expected from a North League great house. But as she scanned the endlessly long dinner table and ballroom floor, she was terribly disappointed to learn the captain wasn't in attendance, only his father and sister being there. Crestfallen, she sulked the rest of the evening away. The following day, she and her brothers and sisters again bundled up against the cold in their mufflers and cloaks, and made their way through the village to the dock to return home to Howell. Verlin was sullen and unsocial as she walked, determined to be a mad stick in the mud. She stopped dead in her tracks. There, parked in the bay, was the Seeker, the captain's ship, and she was certain it hadn't been there yesterday. How could she have missed such a thing? She broke away from her group and went to the dock, pushing through the vendors and passers-by, staring at it in wonder. It was so big, so powerful looking, so real, sitting there in the bay, much different than the flat image she'd seen of it in her telescope viewfinder. As she stumbled open-mouthed with her breath coming out in clouds, she saw out of the corner of her eye 2 fleet officers sitting at a bench enjoying a modest boxed lunch. One of the officers was an elegant red-headed woman, and the other was a tall, regal, blue-haired man. Captain Davidge himself! There he was, her hero. Starstruck, entombed in her furry cloak and muffler, Verlin made her way to them, giggling, not quite sure what to say. The captain noticed her, wiped his lips, and smiled. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, brightly. He looked her over and laughed. I mean no disrespect, my lady, but you standing there all bundled up rather look like a polar bear. Verlin just stood there. She noted his eyes, remembering them from when she was young. There they were. They were the same eyes, only the sadness was gone. Certainly you were here for my father's ball yesterday. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I'm sorry for the cold. One does get used to it after a time. Again, Verlin just stood there, lost in the moment. The redhead sitting next to him rolled her eyes and looked impatient. Davidge put down his sandwich. Well, little bear, is there anything I might assist you with? Are you lost? Captain Davidge had an easy manner to him, belying his stature and his fame. He genuinely seemed a decent man. Verlin felt her initial bashfulness fade. She opened her mouth to speak. The red-headed woman cut her off. My lady, if you will, the captain is at his lunch and shan't be disturbed. You'll most likely find your ship in that direction. She pointed to the far end of the dock where a group of house transports awaited. Stung a bit, feeling she'd terribly shamed herself, she turned and walked away, wishing the ground to swallow her whole. She heard the captain reproach the woman. That was very rude, Hath. Ma'am? Ma'am? He called out, but Verlin just kept walking. She had never felt so humbled. Verlin was one of the few civilians who knew of the 2 battles of Marendra III as they happened. Of course, in the following days and weeks, the fleet was hailed as conquering heroes. Songs were sung, stories told, and all glamorous and romanticized. She was one of the few who appreciated how close the League came to falling. She was one of the few who understood the cost. She remembered her heartbreak as she watched the fleet vessels limp back to dock, some badly battered, others in full tow, others so badly damaged they were scuttled right there and then. And then there were the ships that never came back at all, and there were many of those. The empty berths, the loss of life, old friends gone and turned to dust. The Seeker. Where was the Seeker? She scanned around, desperate. Where was it? Where? Ship after ship, in various stages of distress, and no Seeker. Then, after hours of searching, there it was, Captain Davidge's ship, blackened, pocked with battle damage, but undefeated and unbowed. It flew amid the sad carnage with unmatched grace and beauty. Verlin had seen enough. She was going to join the fleet. She wanted to get up there and do her part. You want to do what? Lord Merivale of Hobby asked, incredulous. Verlin, in her teal hobby gown, sat at the grand table. Hopkirk, her footman, stood behind her. I want to join the fleet. Merivale gawked at her. You must not be feeling well. Hopkirk, check her temperature, will you please? Perhaps she is addled with some airborne fungal malady. I read in a fascinating Hospitaller Gazette that the temperature of one's forehead is often telling when determining the presence of infection, he said proudly. Hopkirk put his hand to her forehead. Her forehead feels normal to me, my lord. Annoyed, Verlin moved his hand aside. Father, I'm fine. I wish to join the fleet. I wish to make a contribution of some sort. I wish to see the stars. Merivale put his hand to his chin and thought a moment. I know, he exclaimed. What you need is a good husband. Someone to help you forget all those lurid posts you love to read. How you sleep, sometimes I'll never know. We'll have a grand ball, with you as the lady of honor. Gentlemen from all around the League will be at your leave. I shall be glad to fall in love and be married some day, Father. But first, I wish to serve. I wish to join the fleet. Lord Merivale glared at her as his plate was filled with a whole steaming roast duck by his footman. You will not be joining the fleet. You will be engaged in simple frivolity. You will begin a tapestry. You will fit for more gowns. You will laugh and gossip with your sisters and your friends. You will go to town and spend a vast quantity of my money. You will do the things expected of a lady. You will not, however, join the fleet. A roast duck flopped down onto her plate with a splat. We shall see, father. We shall see. The next day, Verlin made her way to Howell, to the quaint fleet office there in the town square. It was a lovely day, the birds, the sun, the fountain gurgling happily. Determined, she marched to the steps of the fleet office, only to be intercepted by Hopkirk, the footman, who forcibly dragged her home. She tried again the next day, and the next, always Hopkirk popping up from nowhere, and always the embarrassing trip home. She tried a dirty trick the next day, knowing that Hopkirk will be compelled to drink her tea or beverage should she breach any of House Hobby's loose dining protocols. Verlin kept violating the house rules intentionally. With a sigh, Hopkirk then took her full goblet and drank the contents down. She did it 4 times at breakfast, and then another 6 times at lunch. She then went to howl. Watching from a bench at a distance, she scanned the area and waited. Hopkirk emerged from the bushes in front of the fleet office in a state of obvious distress. She watched as he could no longer stand it and trotted off to find a bathroom. Verlin ran into the office with all speed. With a smile, the lords in the fleet office listened as Verlin made her pitch to join. The lords explained that she may certainly join the fleet. However, she needed to have a signed letter of recommendation from the local lord, or she couldn't join. No exceptions. Her father was the local lord, and there was no possibility of getting him to sign one for her. Defeated and heartbroken, she left the office and allowed the surprised yet relieved Hopkirk to take her home. She tried to forget the fleet over the next few weeks. She stopped reading the posts. She even stopped looking skyward with her telescope. She began a tapestry. She began following her sisters, and she spent massive amounts of her father's money. They went into Howell one morning to gather gossip, and she followed. Again, the lovely town square, the birds, the fountains, and the now reviled fleet office. But something was different that day. A colorful red and black ship had set down in an empty lot just off the square. It was a marine cutter ship. They came regularly, about once every few months, trying to interest recruits. Howell, being a stately and landlocked town, usually wasn't very fertile ground for them, but they made regular appearances anyway. Verlin could see the Marines, regal in their handsome red uniforms, sitting up their table in the afternoon sun. She had a thought, and without allowing herself to fully mull it over in her head, broke away from her sisters and made a direct path to the Marines. The Marines were clearly astounded when Verlin approached them. They sat there behind their table as their glasses of iced tea sweated in the sun and stared at her. A tall young lady of hobby wanted to join the Marines? They thanked her and tried to send her on her way. Her novel prank not really appreciated. Verlin was steadfast. This was no joke. She wanted to join. If the fleet was not available to her, then she'd join the Marines. After a bit more talking, one of the Marines went into the ship and emerged a few minutes later with their commander. Smiling, he invited her into the ship and gave her a brief but lavish tour. He spoke of the Marines' mission, to defend the sisterhood, to serve them and to serve the fleet, to do the things that needed doing, to serve the League. He thanked her for her interest and showed her out of the ship. No, she still wanted to join. She still wanted to be a Marine. He looked her over, tall, fit, and a lady of standing. He bade her take some time and fully think the matter over. He gave her an armful of hollow literature. He said they will return on the morrow, and if she still wished to join, then they will gladly have her. The next day, as promised, the cutter ship returned, and, as promised, Verlin, wearing a canary hobby gown, joined the Stellar Marines. Her experience was not typical. She was treated like royalty. She was trained at an exclusive camp on Baz where only the richest and most favored of recruits went, the sons and daughters of great houses. It was a small class. Not many lords and ladies joined the Marines. There, she was taught to speak with the sisters It was wondrous. She was then, immediately upon her graduation, sent to school at a science facility at Bonham. Again, the best the Marines had to offer, though the Marines had been a second thought, an afterthought, frankly. She grew to love the service for all they had given her. She graduated first in her class and was immediately promoted to P Lieutenant, or Lieutenant Practical, and assigned to the 53rd Marine, a science and weather forecasting outfit located on the Milford-Paulson shores of Baz. Her father, at first enraged that she had joined the Marines, sent word at last that he was proud of her and couldn't wait to see her in person in her uniform. When she got some time off for the Nether Day feast, she went home, and her father threw a grand party for her, a lady of hobby, a celebrated Marine lieutenant. Her commander, Major Westwind, a commoner from Fig on Onaris, but a man whom Verlin greatly respected, had called her into his office. He sat behind his desk and shook his head. She was a disgrace, for creation's sake, V, a rotten, hot-headed, unknoble bore who was in jail more often than she was out of it. Then, somehow, this Kylos of Tusk character ends up the first officer aboard the Seeker of all ships. Of course, we all simply suspected that she was satisfying the captain. I mean, she had no skills to speak of other than she was a Johnny from Tusk with a moderately pretty face. Verlin couldn't believe it. Not Captain Davidge. He wouldn't do such a thing. You meant they were having an affair? She asked. That's what we all thought at first, but it doesn't appear to have been the case in hindsight. I've never been one to particularly dote on the fleet, but apparently Captain Davidge can make a soldier out of anybody. Lieutenant Kylos looked into a very prosperous situation, and she made the most of it, which is why I have asked you here, Lieutenant. Sir, Lieutenant Kylos has quit her post and resigned her commission. Why? Unknown. Some of the bigs over at Zero Foxtrot wanted to throw her in prison, but I suppose cooler heads prevailed. She's already out of the Marines and on her way to Tusk or wherever. Westwind looked at his hands. Her stature as first officer on a main fleet vessel was very much liked by Marine Command. It helped recruiting and helped the Marines in procuring needed supplies from the fleet. It enhanced our general prestige, and now that the Johnny Bronzer is gone, Command is scrambling. They want her replacement to be a Marine aboard the Seeker. He took a deep breath. V, I am loath to ask you this because I do not wish to lose you, but I want to know if you're up to replacing Lieutenant Kylos aboard the Seeker. We think that you are an ideal candidate. Command is trying to get us an immediate audience with the captain. He paused. And I know you shall make us proud. Verlin stood up and went to the window. Outside was a bright sunny day, one just like home. A gardener trimmed the grounds. Officers strolled about. She smiled and put her hands on her chest. Me? Captain Davidge's first officer? I know you've been a fan of his for some time. When do we leave? Westwind sighed and stood up. Immediately, if we're to intercept the Seeker on her current course. Verlin took a deep breath, couldn't believe what she was hearing. I can't wait to meet him at length, to sit in his presence. Westwind grabbed his marine cap. Then I suppose we'll be taking a cutter ship to Heron within the hour. Make haste. Go pack your things. Verlin snapped out of her reverie. Yes, sir, she said, heading to the door. And V, I want you to be careful, yes? I'll be sure to present myself in the proper... That's not what I meant. I don't want you to be too disappointed if Captain Davidge isn't what you hope he is. Our heroes, V, many times are unable to meet up to the standards that we have set for them. Our heroes often let us down. I just don't want you to be too disappointed if that's the case. Verlin smiled. Well, I expect him to be brave and courageous. Obviously, he is those things and more. I expect him to be a fine captain. Apparently, he is that. He got the best out of that paid slug, Lieutenant Kylos, didn't he? If he's a kind man, if he's inspirational and true, then that will be a bonus. The comm lit up. Lieutenant, the comm said, we are getting an immediate evac order from the planet's surface. Who is sending the order? Captain Davidge. Very well. Beat quarters. Recall the sisters and Marines. Prepare to receive and set to station. Once we are fully complemented, begin a forced withdrawal to League space. Aye, ma'am. The missive, Lieutenant Derleth, turned from his console and spoke. I must disagree with this evacuation order. I am in contact with Lieutenant Larson via ship's holographic monitor. He is at the captain's side even now. Clearly, there is malfeasance afoot. Can you put him on the cone so I may speak to him? Of course. The missive pressed a few buttons, and Lieutenant Larson appeared on the cone. Verlin smiled. Lieutenant, is everything all right down there? He replied, It is. The place seems rather quiet. Well, I'm so glad to hear that. We've received an evacuation order from Captain Davidge. I was about to recall the Marines and the sisters with all speed. Larson shrugged. Well, the captain is right here. Would you like to speak to him? I would. Thank you. He leaned over and reached for something. He pulled back Captain Davidge's severed head, dangling from his fist by his hair. Larson's voice became a growl.
You wanted to talk to him, so talk. Here he is, say something.
Crewman Sassy screamed.
You're gonna be joining him before long, Lieutenant. You're gonna die here. You're gonna...
Verlin put her hand to her mouth. Missive, cut the link. Cut it! The missive cut the connection and the cone went blank. By creation, what did we just see? That was a Shadowtech manifestation. I've seen it in the Marines, Verlin said. STTs can inhabit technological devices such as a holomon and bend them however they may please. That was an illusion we just saw. Therefore, speed the recall process. We must recover our people as quickly as possible and begin our retreat. We must also reconnect with the captain and his party immediately. Sassy leaned over her sensors, puzzled. Ma'am, she said. What is it? Ma'am, I'm reading a large ring around the planet's equator. Xandarr doesn't have a ring, Verlin said. I know, yet there it is. It just appeared on my screen moments ago. Verlin rubbed her chin. Let's see it. The holocone flipped, and sure enough, a strange black ring encircled the planet. Verlin stared hard at it. It was composed of dark black material and was sinister to look at. Even at a distance, it appeared to move and throb with purpose and intelligence. I don't believe it. This must be another illusion. She marched into the captain's office and looked out the windows. Sure enough, there it was, huge and ugly around Xandarr where a ring should not be. She rubbed her eyes. Was this an illusion as well? She came back out to the bridge. What is the composition of this ring? Sassy stared into her sensor. Ma'am, she said, it's Shadowtech. It's reading the same as that creature in the image of the Countess we fought earlier. I captured the readings. Verlin had had enough. This whole planet's a death trap. What is the status of the returning Marines? 5 minutes until recovery. Arrow shot on high, the ops said. And the captain and his party? No response since his evac order. Keep trying to raise him. Calm. Have you been taught the base litanies against Shadowtech illusions? I have, he said. Then use them. If you reach the captain, it's possible you could be speaking to another Shadowtech illusion. In any case, if after 5 minutes we've not heard anything, we're securing the Marines and sisters and we're going down after him. Helmsman Sari spoke up. Ma'am, at our current course, we will pass through the planetary ring in 3 minutes. I highly advise steering clear of it. Maneuver away from the ring, Helm, she said. Keep it a wide berth. Sari moved the wheel, and nothing happened. Ma'am, she cried in near panic. The helm wheel is unresponsive. Verlin ran to the helm and moved it. It turned freely, no pressure or resistance. What's happened? Verlin shrieked. Sassy stared wide-eyed at the now useless helm wheel. I don't know, ma'am. It was working fine a few minutes ago. Send to Commander Mapes. He's to the bridge immediately. Priority 1, Verlin cried. Ahead, the black ring loomed ever closer, filling the cone in darkness, waiting to swallow them. They heard evil singing just then, penetrating the walls of the ship from outside, coming from the ring. The singing leached into their brains and plucked telepathic notes on their souls. They heard, "Witness you the planet Xandarr, planet of sorrow, planet of shame, condemned to death, despised in name. Witness you the Black Hat's wrath and the Black Hat's bane. Flee, curious traveler, lest death take you just the same." And with that, we conclude part 3, chapter 14, Verlin's Hero. So we learn, basically, it's an origin story or an origin chapter for Lieutenant Verlin. She grew up in Hobby, was a kind of a bookworm and compared to her sisters and her friends, liked reading the posts in the comforting environs of her library. And she remembered being a child, attending the wedding of Captain Davidge to Princess Marlith, or the wedding that never was. And when I mentioned the wedding baton, in Vith wedding ceremonies, the baton is very important. It's usually brass or bronze and heavily jeweled and inlaid with various things. And the baton comes out of the vaults on a nice little pillow, and all the guests line up in a single line. No matter how many guests they have, it can be a long line sometimes. And the baton is handed to the person in the back of the line. They hold it, and then they hand it to the next person, and the next, and the next, until it reaches the front, where the officiating cleric or priest then holds the baton aloft, and then the bride and groom touch the baton simultaneously, and then they are wed. If, as in the case of the wedding that never was, the baton is stopped and thrown to the ground, there is no wedding. And that's exactly what happened. Davidge's sister, Lady Pardock, later the Countess of the House of Vincent, threw the baton down. She didn't want her brother marrying Princess Marlith, a notorious Zaffin, a capricious little sprite whom she had stared. She has the gift of stare, which allows her to see into her soul, and she saw Marlith as a selfish, reckless waif who would lead her brother to ruin, and she wasn't going to allow it to happen. So when the baton got to her, she threw its ass to the ground. And then Captain Davidge, his wedding over, ran by with sorrow in his eyes, and Verlin saw that. And she had always remembered seeing his eyes, how sad they looked. And she asked her mother, who was that guy? And she said, Lord Blanchford. And she found it interesting. But then that very day, while reading the posts, as she always did, she saw a notice where Davidge had been promoted to a master helmsman. And she found it interesting. And every so often, she would read more posts about Captain Davidge and his various daring exploits as helmsman of the fleet ship Faith. I mentioned that it's a Weber class, and a Weber is a very much older class of ship. It's obsolete in the modern age. They were replaced by the Straylight ships, much more capable, much faster. And then the Weber Straylights, in turn, were replaced by the Triumph class of ships. In any event, she started following Captain Davidge and became like a fan of his, just like if you follow the exploits of a favorite athlete or movie star, that sort of thing. And she eventually amassed quite a collection of articles pertaining to him. And then as he became captain of the Seeker and his fights with Princess Marlith became more frequent, more spectacular, his postings became more popular. Instead of being at the end of the post, they'd at the front, and she found that less intimate than what she had before. She liked them in the back where it was just her reading them. And then she saw the aftermath of the Battle of Marendra III, where the fleet was ambushed by the Zaffins, and that was the high watermark of the Zaffin Armada. That was when they were as strong as they would ever be. The Zaffins themselves, the 5 Zaffins, had created a vast number of ships for them at a great cost to themselves. They were never able to create such a force again. The fleet, though overwhelmed, rallied. There was 2 battles in Verendra 3, 2 parts to it. And the first part, the Zaffins were on the verge of victory, but then the fleet rallied and defeated them. And she saw that through her telescope. She saw the blackened, battered ships return, and she saw the ships that never returned. And she wanted to do her part. Her family is not really a militaristic family, and her father didn't want her joining the fleet. And to join the fleet, you have to get a letter of recommendation from the local lord, which is her dad, and he wasn't going to sign that. No way. So she was kind of stuffed there. But then she saw the Marines show up one day and decide, well, if I can't join the fleet and do my part, I'll become a Marine. Again, fascinating stuff. Something that I put in here in anticipation of having a lot more to write about. Lieutenant Verlin, but those plans again never came to fruition. So this chapter, interesting, doesn't really move the plot along too much, although you do learn a little bit more about her backstory, even though I probably shouldn't have put it in the middle of a big ass battle. The thing with the Holomon and the image in the Holomon of Lieutenant Larson holding Captain Davidge's severed head. Again, STTs can infiltrate and possess machinery. The Black Hats or whoever's controlling the STTs can make them do whatever they want. So they were just basically seeing an illusion. So it wasn't real, as Verlin called. And that's one of the problems you run into when you're dealing with STTs, is you can't necessarily trust your equipment, because you can get bad results, you can get incorrect readings, and so forth. Next week, we return to the carnage below in Xandarr Keep, Part 3, Chapter 15, The Invisible Enemy. We continue with this big fight, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. Trust me. Until then, this is Ren Presents. I am your host, Ren. Peace out.